Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at the late 60s and the early 70s, a time period when Richard Nixon was president, and a time period that also saw a tremendous amount of cultural change and cultural conflict in the United States. Here are your video goals. Let's start by looking at cultural change. So during the 1960s, and especially towards the later part of the 1960s, millions of younger Americans rejected the cultural norms of American society. Younger folks, members of the baby boom generation, are now college-aged adults, and they start making their own choices. And a very large number of them, millions of them, start to choose a totally different way of life and a totally different set of values from those of their parents. And we're just going to look at a couple of their main things that they reject about old school American society. First of all, they totally reject capitalism and consumerism. Maybe not totally, but definitely start to question assumptions about work and money and wealth and owning stuff. Many of them quit their jobs or drop out of school. Some of them start to move to communes. Some of them consider trying to farm to support themselves rather than buying their food at a store and working a job. Of course, many of them just have money from their parents because they come from middle-class backgrounds. So you could accuse them of not necessarily fully rejecting capitalism, but sort of just pretending. But either way, there's a great degree of skepticism about American consumerism and American capitalism. Also, members of the counterculture reject the sort of just assumed respect for authority. They don't think that people should just automatically respect their government or their schools or their churches. Basically, they think that people should not necessarily trust the government, that the government lies to people, manipulates people, that the government is not necessarily looking out for the best interests of the American people or for the people around the rest of the world. Think of the people in Vietnam, for example. And because of this greater doubt of authority, you start to see members of this younger generation engage in massive protests and riots and reject sort of assumptions about patriotism. Like, why should we be proud to be Americans if America is one of the bad guys in the world, more or less? You also see a widespread rejection of Judeo-Christian morality and beliefs. So a lot of assumptions that have been around for hundreds or thousands of years and have kind of been the foundation of American society, the counterculture starts to question. For example, they reject the idea of family as sort of a foundation of society, that other social groups could potentially replace the sort of nuclear family that is one man and one woman and kids. They experiment with new social forms, like communes, where people just all hang out and share, who aren't necessarily related with each other. They develop radically more open attitudes towards sex. In the 1950s, sex was supposed to be between married man and woman and was primarily for the creation of children, and the counterculture questions this. You also see the rise of experimentation with drugs, especially marijuana and hallucinogenic substances like LSD and stuff like that. They think that these drugs are connected with some sort of higher wisdom, or at least a better way of existing than, straight-laced normal America. And you also see the rise of atheism or some combination of Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Chinese philosophies, all become very popular among the counterculture. So anyway, the counterculture, you know, some people were more into it than others, and people who fully embraced the ideas of the counterculture and totally changed their lives in response to it were known colloquially as hippies. And so this was a radical cultural change that a lot of people were very confused by and a lot of people were very concerned about. And there are some interesting causes to all of this. One is simply demographics, that is population change. So as baby boomers were the largest group in America, and they were all born around the same time. And so they all became adults around the same time. These were kids, a lot of them who grew up in suburbs, who grew up watching the civil rights movement. They all come of age at the same time. And a lot of them are very well educated. More baby boomers are college educated than any other generation, any of the other generations that had come before them. So they're willing to question, and they can articulate their views and take a stand. And they're just seeking a different sort of lifestyle than what they experienced under their parents, living in suburbia, or maybe living in a poor, segregated part of the country. But so anyway, these young folks unify to oppose a number of issues, most importantly to oppose the Vietnam War and the draft that was affecting them because they were young Americans and they were the ones being forced to go fight. They also unify to support the civil rights movement and to demand further action, and to support the feminist movement. So all of these kind of unite the young people in sort of a new leftist movement. There are also some harder to quantify cultural factors. One was the rise of rock and roll as a major cultural force. So rock and roll had evolved from the sort of tame music of Elvis to some really experimental, powerful art that is still listened to by millions of people today, known as sort of classic rock. This is stuff like the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and the Doors. And so rock and roll became almost like a religion among the counterculture. There were festivals and all sorts of stuff. And this was combined with the emergence of a new type of drug called a hallucinogenic drug, which brought about altered states of consciousness, similar almost to like religious experiences. And so that combined with rock and roll led the counterculture to believe they had sort of tapped into some sort of new spiritual way of living. And last of all, the availability of reliable birth control and abortions made sexual experimentation much less risky. It used to be for women, if they wanted to experiment with sex, they had to always fear that they would become pregnant before they wanted to. But now with birth control and abortions, that's not really a risk anymore. And this is all locked into place with the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade, in which the Supreme Court decides that the right to abortions is a fundamental right for women. And that is still the case today, and this has been an incredibly controversial court ruling that people still want to overturn today. Of course, with all this radical change, there are a lot of people who are upset. Many Americans, especially rural, less well-educated white Americans, push back against the counterculture. They view it as sort of a breakdown of American society and American norms. These are people who view the family and the church and the government as like the three pillars of our society. They also are worried about the fragmenting civil rights movement and the rise of more militant groups such as the Black Panthers. So anyway, some of the unifying ideas in the conservative movement are anti-feminism. Anti-feminism basically says that feminist policies are actually bad for women and bad for families. there was a constitutional amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, which was trying to make it a constitutional law that men and women deserved equal rights in all areas of society. But strangely enough, a huge number of conservative women, led by this woman named Phyllis Schlafly, organized to oppose this amendment. And Phyllis Schlafly argued that feminism actually hurts women, that women have a special protected role in society and that they need this role. And that anything trying to make women equal to men was actually a bad thing for women. And this movement is so powerful that it actually is able to stop the Equal Rights Amendment from passing. The conservative movement also opposed any further civil rights reforms. There was a big movement called the anti-busing movement that was really important. Basically, in order to desegregate schools, the government needed to bus black people and white people around because of segregated housing. If everybody just went to school near where they lived, and everybody lives in either mostly white neighborhoods or mostly black neighborhoods, that means that the schools are still going to be mostly segregated. So therefore, you have to take kids from mostly black neighborhoods and bus them to schools in mostly white neighborhoods, and vice versa with white kids. And this is the only real way to desegregate schools. But there is massive opposition to this from the white community. Basically, middle-class white people don't want their kids sent to poorly funded, mostly black schools in cities. And this is a very controversial case, and it is also decided by the Supreme Court in the case of Milliken versus Bradley, which says that the government's not allowed to force students to bus across school district lines. And this leads pretty much to de facto segregation in schools. In spite of everything, schools remain either mostly white or mostly black. Real integration, real mixing in schools doesn't happen in most cases. And last of all, the conservative movement was deeply anti-hippie. They opposed basically everything the hippies stood for. And they supported a new type of Christianity called evangelical Christianity, which was a highly emotional branch of Protestant Christianity. It was all about kind of feeling and faith and just knowing kind of this personal experience that God had spoken to you. And it linked up this idea of being a Christian, somebody chosen by God, with being a conservative. So there was a growing idea that only conservatives were really Christians and only conservatives were really doing God's work, and that the counterculture was some evil force almost working against God and against religion. So those are the sort of cultural changes going on in the country at this time. And while this is all happening, we have a presidential election in 1968. So Lyndon Johnson, who had been president for most of the 60s, decides not to run again, even though he's only been there for one full term. So you have a whole new set of candidates. On the Republican side, you have Richard Nixon. So Nixon promises to win the war in Vietnam and to bring about, quote-unquote, law and order back in America, which is basically saying he's going to shut down all these protests and stop the race riots and crack down on people who want to do things differently. The Democratic candidate is a guy named Herbert Humphrey, who tries to appeal to younger voters, but also promises to fight in Vietnam. And this is a bad strategy, because the one thing younger people want is an end to the war in Vietnam. And so millions of young people don't vote at all, because no matter who they vote for, they're voting for somebody who supports the war in Vietnam. And last of all, there was the independent candidate, George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, who had promised segregation forever. And he runs for president promising to restore segregation in the South. Richard Nixon wins by a narrow margin, but he almost lost the race. So Wallace had no chance of actually winning, but if he had won a few more votes, Herbert Humphrey probably would have won instead. So Nixon realizes that he barely made it through this election. So when Nixon comes into office, one of his main goals is to deal with the war in Vietnam and make some progress in resolving the Cold War. And so in Vietnam, he tries to win the war, quote-unquote, on the cheap. And what that means is he's going to pull back from the massive numbers of troops sent in by LBJ. So what he does is he pulls out most of America's troops and instead gives more support to South Vietnam, giving them tanks and air support and money to pay their soldiers and stuff like that. And then on top of that, he unleashes massive, truly massive bombing campaigns against the North, bombing northern cities and strategic locations. And he also bombs the supposedly neutral country of Cambodia because enemy forces are moving through that area. And because of this massive wave of bombing, the North Vietnamese are brought to the table, and they are able to sign a temporary ceasefire agreement in 1973. Now, this is not an end to the war. It's just a pause. Nixon pretends that it is a victory, but in fact, the North Vietnamese are still in a very good position, and as soon as the ceasefire ends, they're going to continue their war and continue making progress. So that is how Nixon tries to win the war on the cheap. It doesn't work. It just appears to work for a little bit. So with Russia and China in the Cold War, Nixon pursues a policy known as détente, which is basically trying to normalize relations with these two communist countries. So in China, he attempts to normalize relations by recognizing communist China as a real country. Weirdly enough, for the last 25 years, the United States had not actually recognized China as China. It had instead recognized the tiny island nation of Taiwan as the real China, and communist China as a bunch of rebels. So anyway, Nixon gets rid of this. He recognizes that this is pretty ridiculous. Also, with the recognition of China, this allows for the beginning of limited trade and cooperation with China, which leads over the course of the next 30 years to a very fruitful trading relationship between the United States and China. With Russia, Nixon begins a series of talks called the SALT talks, which calls for the limitation of nuclear weapon construction by both sides. And this helps to stabilize relations because both sides are no longer worried about the other side getting a leg up and actually trying to win a nuclear war. It basically locks in the nuclear stalemate that existed at that time. So in 1972, Nixon is up for re-election, and he realizes that he barely won last time, so he's going to try to win by a wider margin this time, and he's wildly successful. In fact, it's kind of overkill. So his strategy here is to appeal more strongly to the conservative movement and hopefully win all those Southern votes that last time went to Wallace. And he does this in a number of ways. One is he declares a war on drugs, in which he appeals to conservatives who are worried about the counterculture. Basically, he blames drugs for all the dumb ideas that the counterculture has, and by outlawing drugs, he hopes to restore normalcy. Nixon's Southern strategy, in order to make sure he wins the Southern votes, means that he's going to appeal to Southern segregationists, the people who voted for Wallace last time. So by opposing school busing, by opposing further civil rights actions, and by appointing conservative justices to the Supreme Court, he's able to convince Southerners that he's their man, and he will keep race relations in the South the way white people in the South like them. He also claims victory in Vietnam. He pretends that total victory is close, even though it clearly wasn't. He basically just acts like it was and hopes nobody will notice. On top of all of this, he also engages in illegal tampering in the election. He has a bunch of henchmen known as the plumbers, who go around and do various things to undercut the Democratic Party's campaign with some success. And so because of all of these factors, Nixon wins by a huge landslide. He, if you look at that map there, he wins every single state except Massachusetts, which is just an insanely one-sided election. meaning that, ironically, Nixon didn't even have to commit any illegal activities to win. He probably would have dominated either way. So it seems like things were going pretty well for Nixon, but actually his illegal meddling with the election spells the end of his career. So the government agencies begin to find out about Nixon's illegal activities because during the election, a number of Nixon's dudes, some of the plumbers, were arrested at the WATERGATE Hotel in Washington, D.C., while they were attempting to wiretap the Democratic headquarters. Basically, Nixon was trying to spy on the Democrats illegally so he could know what they were thinking and attack their strategy before they knew what was happening. So anyway, the plumbers are arrested and detained, and people start talking to them, and it seems like Nixon has been behind all of this. Nixon, of course, denies knowing anything about all of this. It says that these guys were acting without his knowledge. However, later on into the investigation, and this is a huge investigation for 2 years, it's like the main news story, but it later surfaces that Nixon had recorded all of his conversations with the plumbers and other people who were in on this illegal scheme. And eventually these tapes are released to the courts. The Supreme Court rules that Nixon has to give up the tapes. And what this does is it shows that Nixon knew about all of these illegal activities and was purposefully trying to cover them up. Because of this, Nixon resigns, and he does this because it was the House of Representatives was getting ready to impeach him. So he resigns. Gerald Ford, his vice president, takes over. And Ford immediately pardons Nixon. So Nixon doesn't go to jail. He lives out the rest of his life as a free man. However, a lot of Nixon's aides do go to jail because Ford doesn't pardon them. And so by the end of Nixon's presidency, the nation is not doing so great. A lot of people are worried that America has lost its way and doesn't know where it's heading anymore. And for good reason. You see American culture splintering along the left and right. We see a president who is clearly crooked and who's been lying to the American people. And America is still engaged in an unwinnable war in Vietnam. The war seems like it's never going to end, and we don't know really how to get out of it. So everybody can agree that America is struggling, but nobody knows how to fix it. And it's because each side in the debate blames the other side. According to conservatives, the counterculture is to blame. Basically, the loss of religion and the breakdown of the family and drugs and stuff like that are making America weak and having people forget the things that have made America great in the past. However, according to the counterculture, it's the conservatives who are responsible for America's decline. The conservatives who got people involved in the Vietnam War. It's conservative fear of communism that has led America to become sort of this huge military power. And it's the conservatives' ideas about gender and race that is dividing America. That basically conservatives are trying to keep minorities and women in a second-class citizen type of role. So each side blames the other, and it's almost impossible for the two sides to talk to each other. And it's not really clear what can be done. And I'm not really sure America comes up with an answer. We'll look at how they try to answer these questions in the coming weeks. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you found it interesting.